He was born in a city of idol worshippers. His father made idols for a living. He had no prophecy over his birth, no miraculous conception, no angel announcement. He was simply a man, a wealthy, successful man in one of the most advanced cities on earth, when something happened that would split the history of the world in two. God spoke to him. If you've ever wondered how one person's obedience can change the entire course of history, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button before we go any further. This story is worth staying for. And he left. That is where most tellings of Abraham's story begin. But the archaeology, the ancient texts, and the biblical narrative together tell a story far richer and far more complicated than a simple story of obedience. This is the real story of Abraham, where he came from, what he left behind, what he suffered, what he doubted, and why. Of all the people alive on earth in the 2nd millennium BC, God chose this one man to build everything on. Chapter 1. Ur of the Chaldeans. To understand Abraham, you first have to understand Ur. Ur was not a small village. It was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a metropolis of perhaps 65,000 people at its peak, located in what is today southern Iraq, near the mouth of the Euphrates River. Archaeologists began excavating it in the 1920s under the direction of Leonard Woolley, and what they found stunned the academic world. Woolley uncovered palaces, temples, workshops, schools, libraries, drainage systems, private homes with 2 stories and indoor courtyards. He found evidence of a sophisticated merchant class, international trade networks that stretched from India to Egypt, advanced mathematics, and a legal system with written contracts. And at the center of Ur, dominating the skyline of the entire city, stood the Great Ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid temple dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It still partially stands today. At its base, it measures 64 by 46 meters. In its original form, it rose in 3 massive terraces toward the sky, topped by a shrine where the priests of Nana performed their rituals. This was the world Abraham was born into, not the wilderness, not poverty. Ur. The Bible tells us his father was named Terah, and ancient Jewish tradition, specifically the Book of Jasher and numerous rabbinic sources, records that Terah was a maker and seller of idols. This is historically plausible. The idol-making trade was a significant industry in ancient Mesopotamian cities, where religious objects were commissioned for household shrines, public temples, and trade. Here is what the archaeology tells us about what that life looked like. Private homes in Ur from this period have been excavated on a street that Woolley somewhat romantically named Abraham Street, though he made no historical claim about the name. These were substantial 2-story structures with thick mud brick walls, central courtyards open to the sky, and a small household shrine in an interior room. The family would have owned specific household gods, small clay or stone figurines, which were believed to mediate between the family and the divine world. Abraham grew up in this world. He breathed this theology. He married a woman named Sarai, whom we know as Sarah, and we are told that she was barren, which in the ancient Near East was not merely a personal tragedy, but a social and spiritual one. Childlessness meant the family name would die. It meant the ancestors had no one to perform the rituals of remembrance. It meant in the cosmology of the age that the gods had withheld their blessing. Abraham was wealthy, but incomplete. He had everything Ur could offer and the one thing Ur could not give him. And then something changed. Chapter 2. The Call. The biblical account in Genesis 12 is remarkably spare about the mechanics of what happened. God speaks. He says, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." That is it. No burning bush, no dramatic vision, no miraculous sign, just a voice, a command, and a destination that is described only as the land I will show you. What makes this theologically and historically remarkable is what is not said. There is no explanation of why Abraham, no record of extraordinary righteousness that earned the call. In fact, Joshua 24:2 explicitly states that Abraham and his father Terah served other gods before the call came. He was not a righteous man who earned God's attention. He was a man God chose, and the distinction matters enormously for how the rest of the story unfolds. The command has 3 layers, and scholars note that they are listed in reverse order of difficulty. Leave your country. Leave your people. Leave your father's household. Each one is harder than the last. Country is abstract. People is social. Father's household is daily bread, inheritance, protection, identity. In the ancient Near East, to separate from your father's household was not a lifestyle choice. It was an act that stripped you of almost every social protection you had. The journey did not happen all at once. Genesis 11 tells us that Terah himself led the family from Ur, heading for Canaan, but they stopped in Haran, a city in what is today southern Turkey, and stayed there. Terah died in Haran at the age of 205. It was only after Terah's death that Abraham, then 75 years old, completed the journey. The archaeology of Haran is interesting here. Haran was also a center of moon god worship. The same Nana who was worshipped in the ziggurat of Ur had a major temple in Haran. Abraham spent years in a city that worshipped the same God he was leaving behind. The transition from the old world to the new was not a clean break. It was a long, complicated journey through familiar territory. At 75, Abraham finally entered Canaan. Chapter 3: Canaan, the Promised Land Problem. The land God promised Abraham was not empty. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, the text of Genesis is explicit. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Multiple city-states, multiple peoples, a complex political landscape that Abraham was entering as a foreigner with no army, no political alliance, and no claim to anything. He lived as a nomad, moving between areas, pitching his tent, digging wells, building altars. The picture Genesis gives is not of a man who received a promise and then watched it be fulfilled. It is a picture of a man who received a promise and then spent the rest of his life in a land he never owned, surrounded by people who had prior claim to every square meter of it. The archaeology of this period, roughly 2000 to 1800 BC, confirms the complexity. Canaan was populated by a collection of city-states and nomadic groups with different cultures, languages, and alliances. Egyptian administrative records and the later Amarna letters show a fragmented political landscape where an outsider like Abraham would have had to navigate constantly. He did navigate, and he did it with remarkable sophistication. When famine hit Canaan early in his time there, Abraham went to Egypt. A practical response, not a failure of faith. When he returned and conflict broke out between his herdsmen and those of his nephew Lot over grazing land, he gave Lot first choice of territory and took what remained, a move that could be read as generosity or as the confidence of a man who trusted that God's promise did not depend on his getting the better piece of land. When he encountered Melchizedek, the mysterious king of Salem described as priest of God Most High, Abraham gave him a tithe, a tenth of everything, in an act that the writer of Hebrews would later describe as one of the most significant moments in the entire Old Testament. And when God appeared to Abraham in Genesis 15 and Abraham expressed the deepest doubt of his life, "What can you give me when I remain childless?" God did not rebuke him. Instead, God told him to bring animals, cut them in half, and arrange them in rows. This is the covenant of the pieces. And for ancient readers, this ritual needed no explanation. In the ancient Near East, covenant ceremonies between two parties involved walking between the divided carcasses of animals, a visible enactment of the oath. May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break this agreement. In Abraham's covenant, only God passed between the pieces. Abraham was asleep. The theological weight of this moment is staggering. God bound himself to the covenant unilaterally. Abraham made no oath. God swore by himself because there was nothing greater to swear by. Chapter 4. Hagar, Ishmael, and the Human Plan. 10 years passed after the promise. No child. Sarah made a decision that was, by the standards of the ancient world, entirely conventional. She gave her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abraham as a secondary wife, so that a child born through Hagar could legally be considered Sarah's heir. This practice is documented in detail in the Nuzi tablets, clay documents from a Mesopotamian city that describe exactly this arrangement as a standard legal mechanism for childless couples. Abraham was not acting outside his faith when he agreed. He was following the best legal and cultural wisdom available to him, but the solution created consequences that are still being felt today. Hagar conceived, and when she did, the text says she began to look down on her mistress. The specific word used implies contempt. Sarah, who had proposed the arrangement and now felt displaced by its success, treated Hagar harshly enough that Hagar fled into the desert. What happened next is one of the most overlooked passages in Genesis. God appeared to Hagar, an Egyptian servant woman, a foreigner, not the recipient of the covenant, not the heir of the promise. And God found her in the desert and spoke to her by name and told her to return and promised that her son would become a great nation. Hagar gave God a name. She called him El Roi, the God who sees me. She was the only person in the entire Bible to give God a name. Ishmael was born, and for 13 years, he was Abraham's only son. 13 years during which Abraham presumably loved him, raised him, and expected him to be the fulfillment of the promise. The text does not tell us what those years were like, but when Isaac was eventually born, Abraham's response to being asked to send Ishmael away was described as deeply grieving. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. This is not the portrait of a man who had mentally moved on. Ishmael was his son. Chapter 5. Sodom, Intercession, and the Nature of the Relationship. Before Isaac's birth, one of the most remarkable moments in the Abraham narrative occurs, and it is the moment that most clearly defines what made Abraham's relationship with God different from anything recorded before it. 3 visitors come to Abraham's tent. Abraham sees them, runs to meet them. He is 99 years old at this point, bows to the ground, and offers the full hospitality of his household. He has no idea who they are yet. This detail matters. Abraham's hospitality is not strategic. It is character. The visitors tell him that Sarah will have a son within a year. Sarah, listening from the tent entrance, laughs. God asks Abraham directly, "Why did Sarah laugh?" She denies it. God says, "No, but you did laugh." The same Greek verb in a different form becomes the name of the child, Isaac, Yitzhak. He laughs. Then 2 of the visitors leave towards Sodom, and 1 stays with Abraham. What follows is one of the strangest passages in the entire Old Testament. God says, in an interior monologue the narrator has chosen to share with us, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" and then chooses not to. He tells Abraham that Sodom will be destroyed. What Abraham does with this information is extraordinary. He does not accept it. He negotiates. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? If there are 50 righteous people, will you spare the city? What about 45? 40? 30? 20? 10? Each time, God agrees. Each time, Abraham pushes lower. He is bargaining with God over the lives of people in a city that is not his, that he has no obligation to, that he rescued once before, and from whose spoils he refused to take a single sandal strap. The intercession stops at 10. Abraham does not push to 5 or 1 or 0. Some rabbinical commentators suggest he stopped because he knew 10 was the threshold below which there was nothing left to save. But the point is not where he stopped. The point is that he started. Genesis 18:17 says God chose not to hide his plans from Abraham because Abraham is his friend. The Hebrew word used elsewhere is yedid, beloved. The prophet Isaiah would later call Abraham God's friend. The New Testament calls him friend of God. This is the relationship, not master and servant, not king and subject, a man who could sit at the entrance of his tent and bargain for the lives of strangers with the Creator of the universe. Chapter 6, Isaac and the Hardest Test. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. The birth was so improbable, so medically impossible by natural standards, that it has attracted both devotion and skepticism for millennia. The text offers no apology and no explanation. The promise was made. 25 years passed. The promise was kept. And then God asked for the child back. Genesis 22 is one of the most analyzed passages in all of religious literature. God tells Abraham to take Isaac to Mount Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. The location, Mount Moriah, is the same site that 1 Chronicles 3:1 identifies as the location where Solomon later built the temple. The tradition holds that this is the same hill. The text is deliberately, almost brutally, laconic. Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey. He cut the wood. He went. 3 days of walking. Not one recorded word between Abraham and God on the journey. 3 days of carrying the knowledge of what he was walking toward. On the third day, Abraham left the servants at the bottom of the hill with a sentence that has been parsed by theologians for 3,000 years. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We, both of us. The writer of Hebrews, commenting on this moment, says Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, that he expected a resurrection, that the covenant promise that Isaac would be the father of nations was so certain in Abraham's mind that he trusted God to somehow resolve the paradox even if the knife fell. Isaac asked the question every child would ask. Father, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb. And then the angel stopped him. The ram was caught in the thicket. The child was spared. And Abraham named the place Yireh, the Lord will provide. But there is something the text leaves unremarked that is worth noting. After this moment, Sarah and Abraham are never described as being together again. The next chapter of Genesis opens with Sarah's death. Ancient commentators, including the Talmud, suggest that Sarah died upon learning what had nearly happened. From grief, from shock, from the collapse of the life she had built around the son she waited 90 years to hold. The test did not end without cost. Chapter 7. The Legacy. What Abraham actually built. Abraham died at 175 years old. He is buried in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, the only piece of land in Canaan he ever legally owned. which he purchased for the full market price of 400 shekels of silver from Ephron the Hittite. The transaction is recorded in Genesis 23 in the kind of legal detail that suggests an actual commercial transaction being preserved in the text: the field, the trees, the specific location, the witnesses, the price. The cave of Machpelah is still there. In Hebron, a massive structure built by Herod the Great stands above the traditional burial site. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all revere it. All three traditions trace their spiritual lineage directly to the man buried inside. That is the archaeology of the ending. But the archaeology of the legacy is something broader. Three of the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, identify Abraham as their founding spiritual ancestor. Combined, their adherents number more than 4 billion people, more than half the population of the earth. No other human figure in history, religious or secular, commands that scope of influence. What did he actually do to earn it? He was not a king. He wrote no laws. He built no temple, no city, no empire. He left no recorded philosophical system. He raised no army that changed the political map of the world. What he did was simpler and harder than any of those things. He believed. Not without doubt, Genesis is full of moments when Abraham questioned, bargained, laughed, panicked, lied about his wife twice, devised his own solutions to God's promises, and sat in his tent arguing with God over the fate of a city. But through all of it, he kept moving. He kept trusting. He kept returning to the altar and the tent and the road. The New Testament puts it plainly in Romans 4. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Not his works, not his obedience, his belief. And that is what makes the Abraham story relevant, not just as history, but as biography. Because it is the biography of a man who was not exceptional in his origins, not perfect in his execution, not free from doubt or fear or human error. He was a man from a city of idol worshippers who heard a voice and walked. And the world has never been the same since. If you look at the geography of Abraham's life, it traces an enormous arc. From Ur in the south, one of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world, north to Haran, west and south into Canaan, down to Egypt and back, across the Negev, up to Moriah. He spent 100 years as a nomad in a land that was promised to him but never given to him in his lifetime. He died owning a cave and a field, but the promise was not for his lifetime. It was for all the families of the earth. There is a line in Genesis 15 that archaeologists have found interesting. God tells Abraham to look at the sky and count the stars. If you can count them, so will your offspring be. This was not metaphorical in the ancient world. People actually believed the stars could be counted. Abraham looked up at the same stars we can see tonight, in a sky darker and clearer than anything we know, and was told they were all for him. He believed it. Standing in a land he did not own, childless at 75, a foreigner everywhere he went, he believed it anyway. And that is the story of Abraham. If this kind of deep dive into biblical history is what brought you here, subscribe, because this is just the beginning of where this channel is going. Drop a comment below. What aspect of Abraham's story do you want us to go deeper on? The covenant? The archaeology of Ur? Hagar and Ishmael? Isaac? Let us know. We read every one.